A federal prosecutor walks into court and walks out as a complainant, not because he did anything wrong, but because he dared to say what everyone else stayed silent about. Hello, today, I want to tell you a story that doesn't begin with statistics, but with a sunny morning in Greenville, South Carolina. A man named Malik Henderson, a seasoned federal prosecutor, walked into municipal court to dispute an unreasonable property tax bill. He was dressed in a sharp suit, carrying a full set of documents, thinking this would be just a simple procedure. But just minutes later, he was fined $750 for being 3 minutes late, while others who arrived even later faced no consequences. The issue wasn't the fine. It was the injustice everyone saw but few dared to name, and that very moment sparked a chain of events no one could have foreseen, leading to an investigation that shook the foundations of the local judicial system. Today's story isn't just about one man. It's about a system and how one ordinary person standing in the right place can change everything. Over the next 25 minutes, you'll join me in exploring how Malik uncovered hidden bias behind seemingly fair rulings, the risky but inspiring journey of a man who dared to challenge the system, and the lesson for all of us: justice doesn't happen on its own. It must be defended with courage. So what exactly happened in that courtroom that day? What drove a seasoned judge to resign after decades on the bench? And why might this story change the way you view justice in America? Let's start from the beginning. That very morning. An ordinary morning, yet the start of something extraordinary. Malik Henderson wasn't someone who showed up late. As a federal prosecutor with over 10 years of experience in the justice system, he lived by strict principles: prepare thoroughly, arrive on time, do the right thing. That morning in Greenville, South Carolina, he left the house early carrying a neatly organized stack of documents, clear evidence showing the city was wrong to raise the property tax on the house left behind by his grandmother. To him, that house wasn't just an asset. It was the old porch where he learned to read with her, the kitchen table where she taught him right from wrong, with a soft but firm voice. And so when the city raised the tax by 30% without notice, he couldn't stay silent. Malik arrived at court at 8:42 a.m., just slightly late for a session that was supposed to start at 9 hours. Sure. He believed he still had time if it weren't for a last-minute emergency call from his office about a human trafficking case he was handling. He handled it quickly, sent guidance to the investigative team, and rushed to court hoping things would go smoothly. But it was here in a worn-out courtroom with beige walls and chipped wooden benches that everything took an unexpected turn. He was fined $750, not for a legal error, but for being a few minutes late. A penalty never seen before for others who had arrived late. A ruling not born of justice, but of bias. And you know what, Juan? In an ideal world, a courtroom is where justice is served with perfect fairness. But in the real world, fairness can sometimes skew due to skin color, job title, or unseen prejudice. That morning, Malik didn't just receive a fine. He realized the system he had trusted could be flawed. And if he, a federal prosecutor, could be treated this way, what about ordinary citizens? Injustice doesn't always scream. It whispers, quiet enough to be ignored, sharp enough to cut deep. Malik could have left the courtroom, stayed silent, paid the fine, and gone on with his day like everyone else. But he didn't. Because sometimes just one person stopping at the right moment can shake an entire system. And at that exact moment, a prosecutor decided to become a voice for truth. When the gavel falls, not everyone is treated the same. That courtroom that morning looked just like any other day. The wooden benches creaked as people took their seats. An elderly woman flipped through her traffic fine documents. A middle-aged man fiddled with his phone, checking for service. Then Judge Charles Whitman entered, tall, white-haired eyes sharp as blades. He didn't need to say much. One glance from him silenced the entire room. People called him the enforcer of Greenville. But perhaps what he really upheld was an outdated, distorted order. Malik sat in the back row, quietly opening his folder. He was ready, the numbers, charts, and tax documents, all in order. This was just an administrative mistake, or so he thought. At 9:15 a.m., the name Malik Henderson was called. He stepped up to the podium, adjusted his tie, trying to stay calm. Judge Whitman looked up, and for a split second, his expression changed, colder, stricter. And then, "You're late. Do you think this court's time is less valuable than yours?" Before Malik could respond, the gavel slammed down. $750 contempt of court fine. In that moment, the room seemed to freeze. A man in a gray blazer currently speaking had arrived later than Malik. The young woman in the front row had slipped in afterward, still scrolling on her phone. None of them were reprimanded, let alone fined. A question started to form in Malik's mind, and perhaps in others. Why only him? Was it because of his job title or his skin color, or maybe both? In America, everyone is taught that justice is blind, that it doesn't see people, only the truth. But there are days you walk into a courtroom and realize justice still sees, and sometimes it sees with bias. According to data from the National Center for State Courts, in many local courts across the U.S., Black defendants are 2 to 3 times more likely to receive harsher penalties for the same minor violations compared to white defendants, especially for small infractions like tardiness parking violations or missing court dates. And Malik, even as a federal prosecutor, was no exception. Justice is not just about the verdict, it's about how you're treated even before you speak. And if bias can happen to someone who knows the law, it almost certainly weighs heavier on those without a voice. Malik stood there silent, no argument, no reaction. He quietly returned to his seat, but in his mind a wave had started to rise. To someone else, it might seem like a small matter, a mistaken ruling, a judge's moment of temper. But to Malik and to anyone who's ever sat in that seat, this was not the first time, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. And so he began to write. Right there in the back row of the courtroom, Malik opened his notebook and began to take notes, not about the property tax issue, but about something few dared to mention: discrimination. When no one speaks up, the truth echoes even louder. Malik sat in the last row, his file still open in front of him, but he wasn't looking at it anymore. He was observing not documents, but people. The courtroom resumed its routine rhythm. A traffic violation, a civil dispute, a person asking for a delay due to family issues. Everything carried on as if nothing had just happened. No one spoke a word. No one asked why was he fined but not the others. No one reacted. No one shook their head, not even a whisper. Only Malik, jotting down notes page after page, and glances, quick, uncertain glances cast his way, seemed to want to say something, then lowered hesitant. He recognized that silence. It wasn't agreement, it was familiarity. The silence of those who had seen injustice tasted bitterness, but were too tired to speak up. In many parts of America, especially in communities of color or lower income, people don't fight the system. Not because they don't know their rights, but because they fear retaliation or simply don't believe that speaking up would change anything. A 2021 study by the Urban Institute showed only 14% of people who felt they were treated unfairly in court ever filed a formal complaint. The rest stayed silent. At that moment, Malik understood. The injustice wasn't just in the sound of the gavel, it was in the silence that filled the room. A silence that reminded him of old stories, cases he had read, testimonies dismissed simply because the speaker lacked title or status. Injustice doesn't always come from wrongdoing. Sometimes it comes from the silence of those who could have spoken but didn't. Then a glance caught his eye. An older man in the front row, gray-haired, dressed in a simple shirt. He turned back, nodded slightly, said nothing, but that look felt like a silent handshake. Malik nodded back. Just that, and it was enough for him to know. He wasn't alone. He opened his phone, scrolled to the Notes app. The first line he typed: disparity in courtroom treatment. 9:15 a.m. Incident Defendant M.H. Below that, he began recording every detail, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever walked into that courtroom seeking justice and walked out wounded. Some might say it's just a small fine, don't make it a big deal. But Malik knew every big change starts with the small things others overlook. Sometimes silence means complicity, and speaking up is a responsibility. When the hearing ended, people slowly stood up, leaving the courtroom like a breeze across a lake, gently rippling, then vanishing. Malik stood up last. His hand still held a pen. His mind, however, was racing with thoughts he couldn't quiet. He wasn't angry. He was clear. Because when someone like him, a man who had stood before countless defendants, countless juries who had upheld the law with near absolute belief, was treated that way for being just a few minutes late, he knew this was no longer a personal matter. He stepped into the hallway, then paused in a quiet corner, pulled out his phone, opened his contacts, and searched for a familiar name: Julia Harper, his superior at the U.S. Attorney's Office. He didn't call, just stared at the name and quietly said to himself, "Not yet. This has to be done the right way." He returned to his car, but instead of driving away, he opened his laptop. Right there in the courthouse parking lot, with sunlight spilling through the window, Malik began typing his first memo. A report, not a dry administrative note, but a real account, with time, location, words spoken, and discrepancy. In the U.S., a whistleblower is someone within a system who dares to speak out against wrongdoing, knowing they may face backlash. In the justice system, this is especially sensitive because the person you're questioning might be part of the very system you swore to defend. Malik knew that well. But he also knew if it doesn't start with me, then who will it start with? Think of Serpico, the NYPD officer in the 1970s who was the first to expose internal police corruption. He was shunned, threatened, even shot, but the truth he brought to light changed the way the entire department functioned. Malik might not wear a police badge, but that day he carried something even deeper, a commitment not to look away. He sent the memo to Julia by day's end, a simple email subject line concern regarding courtroom conduct. Municipal Court, Greenville. And then he shut the laptop, leaned back in his seat, and took a deep breath. He knew the storm was coming. Doing the right thing isn't always safe, but sometimes standing alone is the only way to stay truly free. And justice, if not defended from within, can be easily broken from the outside. The next morning, Malik received a call from Julia. Her voice was calm and steady. If what you described is true, this is not a small matter. I'll bring it to the Judicial Oversight Committee. Malik nodded. Not because he needed permission, but because he knew. He was no longer walking alone. When you look closely enough at the data, the truth will speak for itself. For years, Malik Henderson had combed through thousands of case files. He knew fairness wasn't just in what was written, but in what was overlooked. And this time he decided to do what very few had done to a local court. Cross-reference, compare. Question the numbers. He started with that morning's docket, noting down every arrival time, every penalty, every word from the judge, every look, every tone. Then he expanded his scope, requesting public data from minor court cases over the past 3 years at Greenville Municipal Court. The more he looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't a one-time mistake. It was a pattern, a quiet rule, as clear as sunlight on white paper. Black defendants were fined 3 times more than white defendants for the same infractions. White defendants were regularly allowed to explain themselves, while black defendants were often cut off mid-sentence. For being late, black individuals were cited or fined. White individuals often faced no reaction, and most notably, hardly anyone ever filed a complaint. Malik uncovered a case just 2 months earlier. A 38-year-old black woman was fined $500 for being late to a land dispute hearing, despite presenting a hospital letter explaining her emergency. That same week, a white man arrived 10 minutes late and was forgiven instantly, even received a feel better soon from Judge Whitman himself. These patterns couldn't be coincidence. They weren't professional judgment. They had become systemic, a selective habit, one the perpetrator may not even recognize as biased. Malik understood if he didn't shine a light on it, it would continue, and continue to do harm. He began reaching out to other attorneys who had appeared in Greenville Court. Many remained silent, but some began to speak, through private letters, anonymous messages, and a few with their hearts open. One said, "I used to think I was just being too sensitive. Now I know it wasn't me, it was the system." Another wrote, "Thank you, I saw these things happen, and I blame myself for not saying anything." The most dangerous bias is not the obvious evil, it's the injustice disguised as routine. And every system, if not regularly examined, will eventually become a shadow of what it once claimed to be. Malik compiled the data along with statements, charts, and drafted a report over 30 pages long. He didn't write it in anger. He wrote it with clarity and a modest hope that if people looked truth in the face, they couldn't turn away. Justice cannot self-police, and no one stands above the law, not even the one who holds the gavel. When Malik's 30-page report reached the U.S. Attorney's Office and the South Carolina Judicial Oversight Committee, it was not ignored like so many past complaints. It was read, it was cross-checked, and it was taken seriously because this time the author wasn't a desperate citizen. He was a federal prosecutor. Most U.S. states have judicial conduct commissions, agencies with the authority to investigate and discipline judges for misconduct, including ethical breaches, bias, or abuse of power. But the system is notoriously opaque and often only acts under significant pressure, from the media, from the public, or from people like Malik. And so a formal investigation was launched. No headlines, no cameras, just letters requesting documents, quiet interviews with court staff, and files slowly pulled from dusty drawers. Mrs. Thompson, the silver-haired court clerk who always kept her eyes down, finally looked up. She quietly pulled a worn notebook from her drawer. Inside were years of handwritten notes, dates, defendant names, court decisions, and moments she'd felt something wasn't right. "I'm not sure I should be saying this," she whispered, "but if I don't speak now, then when?" At the same time, James Wilson, the court bailiff for 15 years, the man who stood beside the judge each morning, also stepped forward. "I used to think it was just a feeling," he said, "but now I see, if I stay silent, I'm part of the problem." In 2008 in Pennsylvania, two judges were sentenced in the infamous Kids for Cash scandal, where they received kickbacks for sending juvenile defendants to private detention centers. That corruption only came to light because one insider dared to speak, triggering a cascade of federal investigations. The truth is, even those who hold the scales of justice need to be held accountable. Not because they're inherently corrupt, but because they're human. No one is too high to be questioned. Because when power is unchecked, it doesn't serve justice. It serves itself. The investigation into Judge Whitman expanded rapidly. What began with a fine for being late now became a sweeping review of the city's entire court system. But systems don't change from numbers and accusations alone. They change with public pressure, with voices outside the courtroom. One person may light the spark, but it takes a community to carry the flame. Malik never intended to go public. He didn't seek attention. He believed in procedure, in silent investigations and official letters sent to the right desks. But what he didn't expect came from the very back of the courtroom that day. A law student quietly observing that morning had written everything down. Every word spoken, every confused glance. And the moment Malik stepped back up to the podium, flashed his federal ID and said, "I'm not here just for myself. I'm here because justice must be fair for everyone." That evening, she published a long post on social media titled, "I witnessed justice being twisted, and the first person to fight back was a prosecutor." The post spread like wildfire. Within 24 hours, it reached law forums, local community groups, and eventually major news outlets. The story was no longer Malik's alone. It had become the story of a community of people who had stayed silent, now beginning to speak. Because in a system that feels immovable, a lone voice is easy to ignore. But the voice of a crowd is not. Justice, no matter how powerful, must be watched by the people, and media used well isn't just a tool for headlines. It's a launchpad for change. The George Floyd case in 2020 was initially reported as a death during arrest. Had it not been for video footage and a tidal wave of outrage, no broader investigations or police reform proposals would have followed. The world wouldn't have been forced to reckon with systemic bias. In Greenville, citizens began to share their own stories. A single mother fined double for talking back to the judge when she was just explaining that her child had been hospitalized. A black teenager once denied an installment plan for a fine while his white friend with the same violation was approved with a nod. Individual voices build empathy, but many voices together become a call that can't be ignored. Outside, the courthouse signs began to appear. "Justice should be blind, not biased. We are watching." Hey, thank you, Malik. He still went to work every day, still answered interview questions with quiet humility. "I'm not a hero," he said. "I'm just the first one who didn't stay silent." Justice isn't just in the hands of judges, lawyers, or prosecutors. It lives in all of us. Every time we choose not to turn away, not to be silent, and not to accept wrong as normal. The investigation had now entered a new phase. With media pressure mounting and statistical evidence from hundreds of cases, the Judicial Oversight Committee could no longer delay. A formal report was being drafted, and the future of the long-serving Judge Charles Whitman hung in the balance. But real change doesn't come from articles. It comes from the quiet actions that follow. A week after the story spread across the state, Malik walked into his office as usual. He poured himself a black coffee, opened his laptop, and saw the headline on the front page: "Judge Charles Whitman under investigation for systemic bias." Below it, a detailed article with courtroom images, witness accounts, and undeniable statistics. People in the office turned to look at him. Some gave a nod, some smiled quietly. Malik said nothing, because he knew this wasn't the end. This was a turning point, and after it, there would be a choice: meaningful reform or superficial repair. The justice system isn't short on bold statements, but true reform isn't found in words. It's found in new laws passed to on harmonization. Operating procedures changed, and the mindset of insiders being challenged. After George Floyd, many cities declared police reform. But according to Reuters, only 20% of those proposals were fully implemented within 2 years. Most were delayed, rolled back, or forgotten as public attention faded. In Greenville, the State Judicial Commission announced its first 3 steps. Suspension of Judge Whitman pending the investigation's outcome. A review of all courtroom penalties from the past 5 years. And most importantly, a proposal for local court reform. A reform roundtable was created including legal experts, community leaders, and civil rights advocates. They discussed mandatory bias training for all judges, implementation of a public data tracking system for court decisions, and the creation of an independent community oversight board. Malik was invited to join the reform committee. He declined gently. I don't want this fight to center around me, he said. I just want to make sure that people who enter that courtroom after me don't have to feel the fear I saw that day. He chose to remain an observer, not a leader. Because sometimes real change doesn't need someone standing in the spotlight. It needs someone who won't walk away when the attention fades. A headline lasts a day, but meaningful reform takes days, people, and persistence. A few weeks later, Malik returned to the municipal court not to file a complaint, but to observe the first meeting of the reform working group. That day the room was quiet. No gavel echoed. Just people willing to listen to one another and ask a question long overdue. Justice, are we doing it right? In Malik's office, there's an object that everyone sees the moment they enter. It's not an award, not a plaque. It's a small piece of paper framed beside his desk. A $750 court fine receipt. The one from that fateful morning. When people ask, he smiles. Not because I'm proud of being fine, but because it reminds me every day that even something that seems small can lead to something big. In American history, many symbols of change began with something seemingly minor. A bus seat, where Rosa Parks refused to move. A coffee counter, where the Greensboro sit-in began. And now a courtroom receipt that sparked a wave of change in Greenville. To Malik, that fine wasn't just proof of injustice. It was a milestone. A reminder that change begins not with grand speeches, but with refusing to overlook what's wrong. 1 month after the investigation was announced, a group of law students in South Carolina founded a campus organization on judicial ethics and community justice. The name of the group, the 750 Initiative. They held forums, invited court participants to share stories, wrote reports, and pushed for courtroom audio recording requirements to ensure transparency. That fine inspired far beyond what Malik expected. A young prosecutor in Chicago, after reading the story, began auditing local court records in her own district. A mother in Texas shared the story with her son to teach him that being brave isn't about shouting loud, it's about speaking up when everyone else stays quiet. Sometimes what makes you angry isn't meaningless. It can be the first spark if you know how to keep it burning in the right direction. Malik still works as before, still walks into courtrooms with a leather briefcase, a dark suit, and a calm presence. But one thing has changed: the way people look at him. No longer avoidance, but respect. He didn't change the world, but he changed a corner of the system and opened a path for others to do the same. One day after a talk he gave, a young student approached him. Do you think I could change anything if I'm just a regular person? Malik smiled without hesitation. He answered, you don't have to be a judge or a prosecutor. You just have to not stay silent when you see something wrong. And if enough people do that, there's no system that can't be changed. Justice is not a building, a title, or a gavel. It's the actions of each one of us every time we choose the truth, no matter how small. And perhaps that's what the frame fine in Malik's office quietly reminds him of each day. Keep going, because justice always needs company.